Hi there, I'm Azadeh.
Hello, I'm Calum.
The general election is less than 72 hours away.
And if this election is the first you're voting in, stick with us. We'll bring you the key things you need to know and answer your questions. It's just gone 7 o'clock and we're live across the BBC's news socials, BBC Three and the BBC News Channel.
So in just 3 days, your vote, along with millions of others, will decide which political party gets to govern. And that political party's leader will become Prime Minister and they'll get to move into number 10 Downing Street.
But rather than one you directly vote for thinking who should be the Prime Minister, you'll choose by voting for your local MP. There are 650 across the UK. The party with the most MPs gets to make their leader the Prime Minister.
Now, we're also going to take a close look at the top 3 things that you've told us are the most important to young people when thinking about who you want to run the country.
Yes, we'll explain what happens when you vote, what exactly you can expect when you turn up at the polling station in your area. That's the one that's listed on the polling card you've been sent.
And we really want to hear from you. It's your voice, your vote. Janelle from the BBC Reliable Source podcast is here with us and she's keeping across all of your questions. Hi, Janelle.
Hello. Hi, guys. We are live, so please get in touch with all of your questions. You can head to the BBC News TikTok account and we're going to try and answer as many questions as we can tonight.
Thank you, Janelle. So this live stream is all about reflecting the issues and questions of first-time voters as we head towards Election Day. How do we know what's been on your mind? Well, for almost 3 weeks, my colleague Jordan from Radio 1 Newsbeat has been speaking to a lot of you on a race across the UK. Where are you now, Jordan?
Hello from checkpoint 13. Where are we? I'll give you a clue. Follow me. So we are in Newcastle. That is the Tyne Bridge you can see behind me. To explain a bit about what we're doing, we're racing across the UK. So we started almost about 3 weeks ago now in Cornwall in Newquay, and we are racing to the other end of the country before polling day. So we're trying to arrive in northeast Scotland by Wednesday, and along the way we're speaking to as many of you, so potential young voters, as possible about what's important to you. And how do we decide where we're going to go? Well, that's your job. You have been setting the checkpoints along the way. So 21-year-old Billy asked us to come to Newcastle to speak to people here about what's on their minds ahead of the election. So that's where we are.
You've been on everything from boats, trains and buses, Jordan, I think. What are the big issues you've been hearing about?
Well, we've been hearing about lots of different issues, and some of them specific to the areas that we are at that point in time. But there are themes that have been running across every checkpoint that we have got to. One of the big ones, cost of living. People are telling us they're struggling to afford to live in the UK right now and want to know what the next government's going to do about that. Others include the NHS. People are concerned about waiting lists, how long they're having to wait to get treatment, and funding as well, how much money is being spent on the NHS and whether or not it's enough. And the other is housing. People telling us they don't know if they'll ever be able to afford to buy their own home, and some saying they're struggling to afford rent and to move out of their parents' homes in cases. So those are 3 of the big issues that we've been hearing a lot on this race across the UK.
And what we're doing tonight is all about answering questions. What is it that people have been telling you they really want to know?
Well, people have been telling us they want to know what the next government is going to do for them specifically. So we're in Newcastle right now. That's what people here have been telling us throughout the day. They want to know what policies will affect them, have a change on their lives day to day. So that could be, you know, the cost of public transport. That could be how much their car insurance is. These are all topics that people have been saying to us on the streets. And if you're watching this right now and you have something you want to talk about, tonight's your chance to try and get an answer. Drop us a message. Janelle will be across it on the TikToks and we'll try and get an answer for you on this programme.
Nice one, Jordan. Thank you so much for now. We'll be back with you in a bit.
Now, we did say that we'll be focusing on 3 big topics.
Yeah, which the first of is money. So parties publish manifestos, which is a list of promises or pledges about what they do if they end up forming the next government. In a moment, we'll ask Carrie here what the parties are promising to do.
But before we get into all of that, here's what you've been telling us.
I'd like the Prime Minister to tackle the poverty crisis and the crisis that renters face with private landlords.
It was originally £8 to get the train in the morning, there and back, and now it's £10. I have to work full time alongside my degree to be able to afford it because SFE just doesn't cut it. Student finance is not enough and parents can't always bankroll you.
We know that around about 40% of students have considered dropping out due to the cost of living and also due to rent control.
All right. Harry's here, one of the BBC's top political reporters. Harry, start by giving us a quick idea of the state of the economy and the cost of living.
So over the last few years, we've seen the prices go up for so many things, whether that's food or energy bills or transport, as we heard just then. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for why that is. There are 2 in particular that I'm just going to mention. The first is coming out of the COVID pandemic, when everything sort of got back up and running. That caused a big spike in the rise in prices rising. And the second is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that caused a big spike in energy prices in particular. So those are 2 reasons why prices have been going up so quickly. The rate at which those prices have been going up is now back to normal levels, but that's just a bit of an explanation of why prices have been going up so quickly, why everything has felt so expensive for the last few years.
Right, so that's the picture right now, but what is it that these political parties, at least a few of them, are proposing?
So we're going to be talking about the 7 of the biggest political parties. The reason, so you're clear at home and just for transparency, the reason we've chosen these 7 is because they've done the best in recent results. They stand in the most seats across Great Britain, and they've also done best according to recent surveys of how people tell us they're going to vote. So that's why we've chosen these 7 parties. And if you want more details, I'm going to skim through a few details, but if you want more details, you can find more of what the parties are saying on the BBC News website. But on money, to try and help you with their money, the Conservatives talk a lot about tax. They want to reduce the amount of money that you pay in tax so you have more to spend on yourselves. The Labour, they're talking about making the minimum wage what they call a real living wage to take into account the cost of living, and also they want to scrap the difference, the age difference on the minimum wage, so you won't get less just because you're under the age of 21.
That's 2 of the parties. What about a few others? What else are they saying?
So the minimum wage is also something that the Green Party also talk a lot about. They want to go a bit further than Labour. They want to increase the minimum wage to £15 an hour. It's now £11.44 for over 21s and £8.60 for under 18s. On the question, we heard a bit about transport there. On the question of transport, Labour say they'll gradually nationalise railways to make trains more affordable. The Conservatives have introduced a £2 cap on bus fees in England, and they say they'll extend that. On some of the other parties, the Liberal Democrats, when they talk about money, they talk a lot about energy bills, and they say that they'll reduce your energy bills by investing in renewable energy. The Scottish National Party, which you can vote for if you live in Scotland, they say they'll introduce what they call an essentials guarantee. Basically means they want to make sure that everyone can afford basic necessities like food and energy. And Reform UK, like the Conservatives, they talk a lot about tax. They say they want to increase the amount that you can earn before you start paying tax to £20,000. One final one for you, Plaid Cymru, which you can vote for if you live in Wales. They want to have the power to control tax in Wales and make it a legal requirement for benefits to cover the basic day-to-day living requirements.
All right, thanks so much, Harry. Now, Janelle is still with us, and as we said, she's looking at all of these questions coming in. Janelle, what are we hearing?
So, Cosy Lives is a huge topic on social media. Users have spoken to us about the way that they've changed their lifestyle because of how much money they have. And that's changed things such as dating or even your weekly shop. People can't afford their weekly shop. And Emily has told us that she's had to move jobs so that she's able to afford to keep her car. And others have told us that they've decided not to go to university because instead they can't afford it, so they have to start working earlier than they would want to. And you all can be part of this discussion. Please drop a question in the comment on BBC News on TikTok, Insta or YouTube, because we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Nice one. Thank you, Janelle. As promised, we're also explaining tonight what will happen on Thursday. So if you've not already voted by post, how do you vote in person at a polling station?
Well, Lola from BBC Three's The Catch Up has more.
The place to head to is your local polling station. The address will be on your polling card. It will open at 7 a.m. and close at 10 p.m. When you get there, give your name and address to the staff inside. After you show them your ID, they'll show you to a booth with your ballot paper. The ballot paper has a list of everyone standing for election and if they're standing for a political party. In order to vote, you put a cross in the box next to your chosen candidate. Don't panic if you make a mistake. You can always ask for a new ballot. And if you feel the need to take a selfie, well, don't. There are laws to prevent intimidation or votes being revealed, so photos are deemed a risk. You might also see people hanging around outside. They're volunteers for candidates called tellers who are trying to get an idea of how many people have voted. They might ask you how you voted, but you don't have to answer and they have to be polite. And that's how you cast your vote on July the 4th.
Well, if you're just joining us, it's Azadeh and Calum here, and we're hearing from first-time voters about the things that matter to them ahead of Thursday's general election. And we've got more tips from Lola coming up about how things will work if you're voting on Thursday.
Loads more of those. Plus, we're going to talk about the NHS. So we've talked about cash and the cost of living. Now, the second of those topics you've told us are most important, and it's housing and rent. Let's hear from Beth, who's in Salford.
So one of the biggest issues I've faced is with renting. So throughout uni, finding cheap enough accommodation to stay in. And we ended up staying in the same house for 2 years. The price went up by £30 each month. And the quality of the house obviously didn't get any better. We faced a lot of mould and just dampness in a lot of the rooms. It was very dated, and we were paying nearly £600 a month to live in a house that wasn't really that great to live in and wasn't even worth £600. And now that I've left uni, I'm living somewhere else, but with another couple and my partner, and it's a 2-bed flat. And luckily we've got it quite cheap, but for what we're actually paying, it doesn't really seem worth it. So one thing that I really want to look into while I'm voting is about the renting crisis, because it's obviously going to get worse and worse as the years go on. And getting into the property ladder in the future as well. I don't really have much hope for it at the moment.
And Beth, when you think about all that, do you feel like political parties are actually addressing any of this, or do you even feel like they're trying to get your vote?
I feel like a lot of the efforts with trying to get young people voting has turned onto social media and kind of just mocking the other parties on their Instagram pages and stuff like that. I feel like trying to get the younger voters in has come down to that, and not really showing the policies that they're putting into place and stuff like that. So it is all off your own back and looking into it. And I feel like some of them maybe are trying a little bit more, and there are some other things from other parties that do really count to me. So violence against women and stuff like that, and children's breakfast clubs. I feel like stuff like that is so important, but for me the most important thing is the housing and rent crisis. And I just feel like it's not really being focused on that much.
Beth, thank you so much for sharing some of those thoughts. And Beth isn't the only one to share some of those concerns. She said she thinks housing is the most important issue here. Harry, of course, is still with us. Harry, what's the picture across the UK?
So housing is one of those issues that isn't totally controlled by Westminster, so some of this might depend on where you live in the UK. But across the UK, it is a massive issue, and the overall problem is there isn't enough of it. And that can mean it's basically very expensive because there isn't often another option to choose from. The other problem that we've got with housing is that we were talking a few minutes ago about the cost of living. So your landlords might have had their mortgage go up, and that means they might have passed on that cost to you, and your rent has gone up. So that's the other problem. Finally, the other problem is a lot of the housing in the UK is either old or bad quality. And so unless money is spent on improving it, it can be mouldy, it can be damp, it can be it can have bad insulation. So the question is, who pays for those improvements? This is a very complicated problem, it's a very expensive problem, and it's one that all the political parties are very aware of.
And you mentioned it's a bit different on where you are in the UK, so this is where it gets a bit tricky, but what are the parties promising at this election on it?
So for the Labour in England, they say that they want to make it easier for renters to challenge landlords when they put up their rent, and they say they want to build 1.5 million new homes over the course of the next 5 years, and they say they'll do that by changing the rules around how many houses and how easy it is to build houses across England. One of the things that nearly all the parties say is they want to ban what's called no-fault eviction. So that's when landlords can kick tenants out without having to give a reason. If you remember, the Conservatives promised to do that last time. The law to do that got delayed and it didn't come in before the election, but now nearly all the parties say that's something they want to do. As well as that, the Conservatives, when they talk about housing, they talk a lot about buying your first home, which we heard from just there, and they say that they want to bring in this new scheme called the right to buy, which would basically mean you have to save a little bit less when you buy your first home and cut the tax that you have to pay on that first home up to £425,000.
Yeah, Harry, thank you so much for that. Don't go anywhere, because of course there are more issues that we're going to want your perspective on.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, all the information of all the manifestos is on the BBC News app. We can't get through it all here. There's just too much information there. Janelle, what are people saying on this topic?
Well, we've actually been getting questions. We're streaming live on TikTok as well, and we've got Shadow Knight who's asked, what would happen in the unlikely event we have no majority in Parliament?
Okay, well,
so that's one for you, Harry.
There's one, yeah, Harry. No majority in Parliament. If that happens, so no party has more MPs than all the rest put together, what happens in that situation?
It's something we've seen before. For example, in 2010, the Conservatives were the biggest party, but they didn't have an overall majority, so they didn't have enough MPs to get their votes through. They teamed up with the Liberal Democrats in that case to form a coalition. So that's something that we could see again. We could see a coalition form where one or more parties join together. That's something that's quite normal in other European countries, but it's relatively rare still in the UK. But that's something we could see. Another thing that could happen is it was called a minority government, where even though a party doesn't have enough MPs to have the majority of them across the House, they still think, well, we're almost there, we can maybe get by persuading a few MPs from other parties to vote for individual bills. So those are two options that could happen.
It's a great question, really important to know, right? Because
yeah,
we're not really sure on that one at all sometimes. Now, this is the first general election in the UK where voters will need to bring photo ID to the polling station. So, what can you use as ID?
Well, Lola from BBC Three's The Catch Up has all you need to know on this.
If you don't have an ID on voting day, you'll get turned away. So here's what to do. There are 22 acceptable forms of ID in England, Scotland and Wales, and 9 in Northern Ireland. Head to this article to check out the full list of what you can use. Most of you will take your passport or your driving licence, but make sure it's an original and not a photocopy. Out-of-date IDs are fine, providing you still look the same in the pic. And if you're voting by post, well, there's no need to send in your ID as well. For everything else you need to know about the general election, go to the BBC website.
If you're just joining us, it's Calum and Azadeh live at, 7:20, just about. Tonight, we are hearing from you, young voters, about the things that matter to you ahead of Thursday's general election.
And still to come, we'll bring you some tips for separating fact from fiction on your socials. Plus, we've got another tip from Lola coming up about what to expect when you vote on Thursday and what happens if you can't get to your polling station.
Which does happen, and it's important to know. But now, the third of the big issues you've been wanting to know more about. It is the health service, the NHS.
Now, governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland decide how much to spend on health, but there is a caveat. The overall chunk of money they get is decided by the government in Westminster. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the NHS in our lives, at last count, the NHS in England treated and employed more than 1 million people per day. So it's no surprise a lot of you have questions about this.
Yeah. And that means that we're coming back to you, Harry, for
course.
more of the issues that we're facing Right now, on the health service, what are some of the things?
So the overall problem, one of the biggest problems that the NHS is facing is waiting lists. And the NHS, is, as you said, is one of those issues that is slightly different in different parts of the UK, so it might depend on where you live. But in England, more than 7.5 million people are on the waiting list, and it's been a key issue in the selection. And that means that if you or a loved one is waiting to get treatment for an illness or anything else, you may have to wait longer than you would otherwise. The other problem is staff shortages. There's basically not enough doctors and nurses to go around. So why is the NHS in so much difficulty at the moment? Part of that is the longer term. People are living longer, they're needing more treatment as they get older, and there hasn't been enough nurses and doctors trained over a long period of time. The other problem is coming out of COVID, during the COVID pandemic, so many people who would otherwise have got treatment for day-to-day issues didn't go and get that treatment. And so there is basically a backlog of appointments for people who would otherwise have got treatment during those years, and the NHS is basically having to catch up, deal with that backlog, try and bring those waiting lists down, as well as do all the other things they would normally do on a day-to-day basis.
And Harry, you know what I'm about to ask you, especially when it comes to something like health, which is so important to so many of the people we're hearing from. What are political parties proposing? At least some.
I'll give you a snapshot of a few of them. So one of the main promises that Labour are talking about is about that waiting list that we were just talking about. They say they'll pay NHS staff extra to work in the weekends and evenings, and they say that will give 40,000 extra appointments a week to try and bring that waiting list down. And we know that a number of people have written in about mental health in particular, and they say they'll make sure that in every school there's access to a mental health professional, and they'll hire 8,500 more mental health staff in the NHS. The Conservatives want to continue with their plans to build 40 new hospitals and also make sure that there is mental health support in every school and college, as well as increasing NHS talking therapies.
And a couple of other parties, because that's two of the big ones.
Yes, so the Liberal Democrats also talk a lot about health in their manifesto. They want to significantly increase the amount spent on health, and they'll fund that through bigger taxes on the banks and the wealthiest people. And on mental health, they focus particularly on early access support. The SNP in Scotland, they also, as you were saying, the money that they get is dictated by Westminster. So they want the amount of money that they can get for health to be increased, and they're also called so that they can spend more on health in Scotland. And health is also a big issue for Plaid Cymru, which is their party you can vote for if you live in Wales. And like Scotland, the money they get is also governed by Westminster. They want to change the formula basically that amount is decided by, so they get more for health, right. And they want to increase the number of GPs across Wales as well.
Loads of information to get into there, not surprisingly because of the issue, Janelle. People talking about it on your socials. Yeah.
Yes, wait lists and recruitments, things that you've just mentioned, and a lot of the discussions on social media surrounding the NHS are about the parties and how they plan to make the NHS more attractive to new talent. And David said there's no incentive to work for the NHS. He says there's less stressful jobs that pay much better. And people have also been speaking to us about what parties propose to do for existing NHS staff, and others have shared their experience working for the NHS. But this is being streamed. You guys are able to get involved. So do leave a comment on BBC News on TikTok, Insta or YouTube. We're keen to hear your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Janelle. Janelle's not going anywhere, so keep them coming. Now, we have got so much more on this and the other issues we've been focusing on tonight, along with plenty of others on our manifesto guide, which you can find on the BBC News website. So you're all set to go and vote on Thursday. But what happens if you can't make it to the polling station at the last minute?
Yeah, you want to know this. Lola from BBC Three's The Catch Up is back with what you can do.
Okay, so stuff happens. Maybe you had to leave town for work, or you're too ill to leave your house. If you can't get to a polling station, you're going to need an emergency proxy vote. It's basically getting someone else to vote for you. You'll need to fill in an emergency proxy vote form and return it to your local council. The deadline is usually 5 p.m. on the day of the election. Someone will need to confirm why you need a proxy. If you're too ill, it could be a doctor or a health professional. If you're busy with work or last-minute travel, it could be your manager. You'll then need someone who is also registered to vote to go to the polling station and mark your ballot for you. Hopefully you won't need to do any of this, but now you know how to vote in an emergency.
Hopefully not, but Harry, you're going to stick around a while longer to answer questions for everyone with us on BBC News socials and iPlayer, so keep the questions coming, right?
Keep them coming, but another quick one from me first, please. What actually happens on election day?
So on election day, the polls open at 7, so you can go to your local polling station and cast your vote. We here at the BBC and all the other broadcasters, we're governed by actual laws in Parliament that mean that we can't report what political parties are saying, what political leaders are saying, and the idea for that is that we don't influence how you're going to vote on that day. So there will be a bit of a blackout. We will say that people are going to the polling stations, we will send you pictures of dogs at polling stations, but we won't actually tell you anything about what the party are saying that day, because it's your turn to make your decision and vote.
Right, it's
Everyone
not
loves
like...
dogs at polling stations.
Totally,
to be
my
fair.
dachshund loves it. And it's not like we've just completely forgotten to talk about politics on election day. We really don't actually have the ability to. We're not allowed to. Now, another thing to keep an eye on over the next few days is separating fact from fiction around what you're seeing on social media. And that's Mariana's bread and butter. She's our expert on this from BBC Verify. And so many young voters actually get their news from social media, don't they? So what do they have to look out for?
Totally. And a lot of people watching probably are just kind of consuming the election through their feeds. That means they're seeing all kinds of stuff, like stuff about the Euros, stuff about other things they're interested in, as well as content about the election and political posts. And as we approach polling day, that's going to start to ramp up. You're going to see more and more of it. So what should people be looking out for? The first thing I think is to really look at, just be really aware of the kind of content you're being recommended. So we're obviously seeing a lot of paid for adverts, stuff that's coming from the political parties themselves. I think everyone's quite used to dealing with content that's sponsored or paid for and it's quite clearly labelled. So just be aware of that kind of content. But most of all, and the thing I've been seeing a lot of, is what we'd call kind of unofficial content or content that's not paid for. That might be coming from the parties themselves. So on your TikTok feed, you might start to see kind of more of the meme wars that have been going on between the parties and them kind of taking aim at one another. Just take a second to kind of interrogate that and think, right, what are they telling me? What's true? What's not? But then there's also the stuff that's kind of totally unofficial, not from the parties at all, but from the average person who has gone inadvertently or unexpectedly viral, where they've been like, oh, hang on a second, I've just woken up and my view about the election has totally blown up. And it's that kind of content that sometimes it's just someone's opinion, it's reliable. Sometimes it can be a bit misleading. I kind of call these people the accidental social media influencers. Quite a few I've chatted to aren't even old enough to vote. They just want to get involved, and that's a really good thing. But with great virality comes great responsibility. And so you've just got to be really aware of the kinds of stuff both you're posting and that you're seeing.
Everyone's gone viral on certain things. It might not always be politics. It's dead easy for it to happen. If someone watching this is looking at their feeds and looking for the signs of places to go, good signs for information, what are those they should be looking for?
So I think it's really important that we kind of all become almost kind of like digital detectives. Like we're all just looking into everything that gets pushed to us. So once you've kind of sussed out, right, who has this come from? Take a proper look at their account. Like when an account is recommended to you, kind of say, right, okay, is this an official account? Is it a political party or a campaigner? Have they got an agenda? Do they want to tell me something? Or is this an account that belongs to the average person, a bit like me? How reliable are they? Like look at some of their other posts. What are their views? Look at some of the other content they're sharing. Maybe the account doesn't have any identifying features at all. Like it's just got loads of numbers in its username or not a picture. That kind of thing is a little bit suspicious sometimes. Sometimes it can be real people, sometimes not. So be really aware of that. And the last thing I think is just be really conscious of any kind of content that could have been edited or manipulated in some way. I think people thought there might be a tsunami of deepfakes this election. That hasn't quite happened in the way we thought. There's a lot of parody content, stuff that's quite funny. There's also stuff though that from committed political activists that has been quite convincing. So just be really aware of that kind of stuff. If there's, an extra finger or a missing eye, it might be AI generated. If it's a bit robotic, then it might be AI generated audio. Go and just check out on other websites, it might be the BBC News website or another news organisation you trust, whether that thing actually happened or not. And don't always rush to the comments because it can be tempting to, but they can be a bit misleading sometimes.
Yeah. Listen, Mariana, thank you so much for all of that. We can follow you as well on socials. Another good idea on how to do it.
Very good idea.
Exactly. Now, we are about to disappear if you're watching on BBC Three and the BBC News channel. Before we do, let's head back to Newcastle and say goodbye to Jordan. Jordan, you're on a tour of the UK. Where are you heading next?
Yeah, welcome back to sunny Newcastle. The sun's come out for us, but our next stop, well, we have to get to Inverness before polling day. So our next stop is in Fife tomorrow before we then head on to Inverness, where I think, Calum, you might be joining us. But you might be watching this in Scotland thinking there's issues in your area that we haven't talked about in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And if that's the case, there is still time to get in touch with us. It's not too late. So if there is something you want to say, get in touch with us. Drop us a message, drop us a comment, and whatever you're watching, we'll try and get the answer to you. But what it might be too late for is my train, so I gotta get a move on. I will see you guys later. I love you and leave you.
Thank you, Jordan, so much for that. You got to get your train. You can't be missing your train.
Cold. He just walked off, but all right.
Yeah, listen, keep the questions coming in for us. We're here for a bit longer on BBC News socials. We're not done yet on those. We are going to finish up pretty soon, though, on BBC Three and the BBC News channel.
Yes, so again, keep those questions coming though, because we will still be here on socials. Now, of course, BBC Three, you've been watching us as well, news channel as well. Goodbye for now. Switch to your socials to get more.
Yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a good evening.